Looking at Jonah chapter 1, starting with verse 13, and we'll read the verses in the rest of the chapter, and then through 2:1 eventually we'll talk about in this session. So starting with verse 13, Vayachteru, down over here, ha'anashim lahashiv el hayabasha, velo yakolu, ki hayam holek v'so'er alehem. So we have the fairly rare verb chatar, just means to dig, or in this case to dig into the water, to row hard. This is one of our interesting one gutturals, and the issue here is that we have what would normally be a compound shua, a hataf patah here, but for some reason the shua stays simple. This looks for all intents and purposes like a hifil, but it's actually a kal. We just have to remember that with a one guttural, sometimes, particularly when you have a chet, the guttural refuses its normal hataf patah, but it does cause the prefix vowel to reflect, even though you don't see what it's reflecting. Okay, so this is a kal. You can tell it's vav consecutive because of the patah under the vav and the doubled first letter. Vav consecutive imperfect, 3MP. So we have they rowed, and that would be the men over here. The men rowed hard, or dug into the water. And now we have a hollow verb here. Call this a tu vav, and its shuv is the root, and in the hifil, that middle vav root letter changes over to a yod, and we have the lamed, which tells us that it's an infinitive construct. And so they rowed hard to return. This is the word for return. We'll be looking at these so-called hollow roots soon. To return el hayabasha, to the land, to the dry land. We saw that word earlier in the chapter. Velo yakolu. We just had the root yakol recently. Velo yakolu. They were not able. Ki hayam holek v'so'er. We saw this earlier in verse 11. Over here we saw the sea holek v'so'er, and we said it was going and storming, or perhaps increasingly storming. And so we come back down. For the sea, ki hayam holek v'so'er, was going and storming, or increasingly storming, alehem, upon them, or against them. And so, looking at the verse then, and the men rowed hard to return to the dry land, and they were not able, for the sea was going and storming upon them, or perhaps increasingly storming upon them. That's verse 13. Let's move on to verse 14. Vayikra'u el Adonai, vayomaru ana Adonai, alna novda, benefesh ha'ish hazeh, va'al tetain alenu dam naki, ki ata Adonai, ka'asher chafatzta asita. So, vayikru, again, kal, a vav consecutive imperfect, and again it's the yod prefix, the shurik ending. The hirik prefix vowel tells us it's a kal imperfect, vav consecutive, and it is they called, and this would be the men, and they called to the Lord, El Adonai, to the Lord, vayomaru, and they said, Ana, which is a word for please, I pray, please, O Lord, alna, and al is the kind of negative that we use with volatives such as requests. They're being very polite here. Please, O Lord, do not please, do not, we pray. Novda, here's one of our interesting one aleph verbs that's a special case. we have the aleph quiescing, and we have this cholim as the prefix vowel. And then the prefix being noon, pretty much the special cases happen for cal imperfects. So they're weird when you see them, but once you see them, you're pretty sure you're looking at a cal imperfect. And so we have a one common plural with the hey is telling us it's a cohortative. So we have, do not, we pray, let us perish, benefesh, with the soul of this man. And so we have ha'ish hazeh down here. Ha'ish hazeh, that's definite, this man. And then we have benefesh, which is technically indefinite, but it's in construct, and so it picks up the definiteness of ha'ish hazeh. So it becomes with the soul of this man. And we come down here to the bottom. They're continuing this request. Va'al, that's the kind of negative that's used in volatives. So, and do not titain. Here's one of our strange versions of natan. In this case, we have a cal imperfect second masculine singular referring to the Lord. And do not give upon us, or really do not return upon us, or do not set upon us, dam naki. Dam we know is blood, naki is innocent, and so do not set upon us innocent blood, or essentially do not charge against us innocent blood. And then here's why. Ki, ata, you, O Lord, sort of putting in an O there, O Lord, ka'asher, as, chafatzta, as you have pleased, asita, you have done. So kind of an odd order for the way we think of things, but for you, O Lord, as you pleased, have done. Or we might say, for you have done, O Lord, as you have pleased. So that's verse 14. Let's go through the entire verse. And they called to the Lord, and they said, please, O Lord, do not please let us perish with the life or with the soul of this man, and do not set against us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, as you have pleased, have done. Let's look at verse 15. Vayisa'u et Jonah, vayitaluhu el hayam, vaya'amod hayam mizapo. So we have vayisa'u. Recognize this as a one noon verb, and the root is nasa. We expect to see a dagesh forte. I'll mark it here in red. We would expect to see a dagesh forte there, but remember sometimes when we have these Scheme Levi letters, if there's a vocal schwa, the dagesh forte may drop out. And sure enough, it's doing it here. So we're losing our usual clue that we have a one noon verb. Here we see the sin and the aleph, and we don't see those very often except when they're part of this verb here, nasa. So it's just one of those odd features of Hebrew. So we have vayisa'u, and they lifted up et Jonah, they lifted up Jonah. This is a root we have seen a few times before in this chapter, and it is our root tool, and it appears in the hifil, and it is a little bit hard to recognize here. The theme vowel is a hirik. We would expect to see a hirik yod, and sometimes the text just shortens those down to a regular old hirik. And so this is one of the ones that might be hard to parse, but it is a hifil, and it's got a pronominal suffix here. The kibbutz here is what we would normally see as a shurek, but when we put the pronominal suffix on, sometimes that gets shortened down to a kibbutz. And so that's why we're not seeing the normal imperfect ending of a shurek. So they picked Jonah up and they threw him to the sea, or into the sea, El Hayam. Vaya'amod. Now here's a one guttural that is acting the way it should, where we have the Hatef Patach and then the Yod prefix has its vowel reflecting. So in this case it's a Kal again, but we can easily see that this is not a true Patach, it's a fake Patach because of reflection from the R1 half vowel here. Also the Holam theme vowel tells us that it's a Kal. So we have Vaya'amod and Hayam, the sea stood. In this context it would mean it ceased. Mizapo. Here we have an infinitive construct with a mem prefix and a pronominal suffix, 3ms. And Za'af would be literally to rage. And so the sea stood, or we would translate it ceased, from its raging. So let's read it again. And they picked up Jonah and they threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped from its raging. And now verse 16, Vayira'u ha'anashim yirah gdolah et Adonai, vayizvachu zevach la'Adonai, vayidaru nidarim. We've seen this idiom earlier, to fear a great fear. We have a vav consecutive, which we can see it's an imperfect, and the men feared, they feared a great fear. We saw that earlier in the chapter. This is a little bit unusual because we have two direct objects, and the word fear does not normally have two direct objects without the word and between them. Here they feared a great fear, the Lord. And so we would translate that, and they feared the Lord greatly. But notice down here, you've got this little a and this little a, and then we have a note based on that, and the editors are asking, was this added in later? Because it's a little bit awkward. And they feared a great fear, the Lord. And so they're wondering, since this is so awkward, why is it here? Normally we can ignore these editors' notes unless they give us something more substantive than their own opinion. A normal rule of textual criticism is, if something is awkward, it's probably, unless it makes no sense at all, it's probably original, because people don't normally make changes that create more awkwardness. They go in later and make changes that create less awkwardness. Anyway, so the meaning is pretty clear, and the men greatly feared the Lord, meaning the divine name, the God of Israel, who Jonah had named earlier in the chapter. Vayizvachu zevach, and they sacrificed a sacrifice, very common way to say things in Hebrew, to the Lord. Vayidaru, this is the one noon verb nadar, to vow. And we have a dagesh forte in the dalet to indicate that the noon assimilated with the dalet. So this is a kal imperfect vav consecutive, third masculine plural. And they vowed nidarim, and they vowed vows. So they feared a fear, they sacrificed a sacrifice, and they vowed vows. And we might just say they feared greatly, they made a sacrifice, or they offered a sacrifice, and they made vows. The Hebrews love to pair together verbs and nouns from the same root. So fear a fear, sacrifice a sacrifice, vow a vow. That is verse 16. Final verse in the English version, they put a 17th verse in the first chapter. Occasionally, as we'll see, the Masoretic text numbers a little bit differently. And so they have chapter 2 verse 1 is the equivalent of our English Bible's 1 verse 17. Let's take a look at chapter 2 verse 1 in the Masoretic text, or 1:17 in the English Bible. Vayaman Adonai dag gadol, livloa et Jonah. Vayehi Jonah b'ma'e hadag shilosha yamim ushilosha leilot. So here's our verb. We haven't seen these yet, but it's a 3-hay verb, mana, and oftentimes with a vav consecutive, the hay drops off. We can say it's a vav consecutive. Notice that again we have a scheme and Levi letter, and so the dagesh forte, which would normally have been there, gets dropped. We can tell it's a vav consecutive because of the patak under the vav, and the prefix letter matches an imperfect prefix letter. We can also tell this is a piel because we have a vocal schwa as our prefix vowel, and we have a patak as our R1 letter. Well, that matches piel. So we have a piel, imperfect, 3ms, vav consecutive, and the Lord, mana means to appoint, appointed. What did he appoint? A dag gadol, a great fish. And then we have a nice infinitive construct here, livloa, of bala, to swallow et Jonah, to swallow Jonah. Vayehi Jonah, this is our typical vav consecutive, and Jonah, we might say, and it came to pass, Jonah was, we might supply a was here, or possibly we could just make the vayehi relate to Jonah, and Jonah was, put the was over here. So either, and it came to pass, Jonah was, or just Jonah was, in the stomach of the fish. This is just our noun ma'ah, which, similar to what we saw with the verb mana over here, sometimes a hay will drop off in certain cases. Similarly here, the hay dropped off when we make a masculine plural construct. In the stomach, in the entrails of the fish, and then we have shilosha, 3 yamim, 3 days, u shilosha leilot. This is la yala, night, and this is the plural form of it, 3 nights. So we have, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and it was, Jonah was in the belly or the stomach or the entrails of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So that's the end then of this section.